Welcome to the Digital Government Podcast. Tune in to discover the future of governance and ways of getting there.
Welcome to listening our Digital Government Podcast. My name is Merle Maigre, and today we are featuring key speakers of our upcoming e-governance conference taking place in Tartu in Estonia in May 22-23, as well as online. Today, I'm proud to present a distinguished cybersecurity expert, Professor Andrew Grotto, and we will be discussing cybersecurity as seen from the US perspective. Hi, Andrew.
Hi, Meryl. It's good to be here.
Yeah, it's really good to have you here. Andrew, Professor Grotto, you are an educator, you are a researcher and a consultant. Today you are at Stanford, but can you tell us a little bit about yourself, about your research and your students?
Great. Yeah. Well, again, thanks for having me on. It's a real privilege and pleasure to be with you now, and I'm looking forward to the conference later in May. So I lead a research and teaching program at Stanford University on geopolitics, technology, and governance. I also serve as the faculty lead for the cyber policy specialization that we offer through our 2-year master's degree program in international policy. I came to Stanford in 2017 after spending many years in the US government, most recently as the Senior Director for Cyber Policy on the National Security Council at the White House, a position I actually held in both the Obama and the Trump administrations. And so I think I may be one of the few people on the planet who served in a senior White House role for both of those two very different presidents. I worked, but before the White House, I was the Commerce Secretary's senior advisor for tech policy. The Commerce Department is one of those quirky agencies in the federal system. It's home to a pretty eclectic array of agencies, including the National Institute of Standards and Technology, the Bureau of Industry and Security, which does export controls, the International Trade Administration, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. And so there's actually a lot of tech policy done in that department. And then before that, I worked in the U.S. Congress. I was on the professional staff of the Senate Intelligence Committee. This is the committee in the U.S. Senate that's responsible for overseeing the U.S. intelligence community. And my job specifically was to oversee the budget and operations of the National Security Agency, as well as cyber analysis and collection across the U.S. intelligence community. My research now focuses on a mix of cyber policy, cybersecurity, with a lot of focus on regulatory policy, both here and globally for critical infrastructure, as well as some of the bigger sort of geopolitical dimensions of U.S.-China technology competition, where our allies fit in, including Europe, so think semiconductors and areas like that.
Sounds fascinating. So what kind of students do you have? Who are the people who study, who participate in your lectures and your seminars in Stanford? What can we say to students sort of like who are thinking, what should I study? Should I study cyber? Why is this important?
So our students are, I should first say, it's a small program. We only have about 25 students per class year, so there are about 50 students total in the 2-year program. We almost always have at least one student from Estonia. So Estonia is well represented in the program. So our students tend to be a mix of people who are interested in working in the private sector in sort of policy or policy adjacent roles within tech companies, or people who either want to work in government or already are working in government and have taken a temporary leave of absence to come study with us. Our students tend to be a little older than most graduate students in the United States. Our students tend to be in their mid to late 20s, so we typically prefer students who have a little bit of work experience before they come back to us, at least in this program. And I don't think there's a better place to study anything tech related than Stanford, located in the heart of Silicon Valley. Technology sort of permeates almost everything that we do out here. And so even for students who are not necessarily interested in cyber policy per se, for students who are interested in bigger international security questions, energy and environment issues, human rights issues. All of these issues now have a technology dimension. So even for students who don't want to necessarily specialize in cyber policy, I think our program is a great way to to gain some exposure and some experience and some expertise in technology, which again touches on virtually every facet of international affairs these days.
I couldn't agree more. As a former national security advisor myself, I very much agree that these days you cannot understand security without understanding cybersecurity. So, with your background, I think you're really really well experienced to connect the both sides, the public and the private sector. From here, I think to kind of like jump into the more content sides of the discussions, to sort of get us warmed up. Maybe I would ask from you, what how do you see, or what's the big picture insight of the current direction of the U.S. Cybersecurity policy? What kind of late developments would you outline as key for anybody who wants to understand the thinking and the latest sort of like milestones in this U.S. cyber policy development?
Well, there's actually a lot happening here. I think there's a misperception, particularly in Europe, that that the U.S. Doesn't really legislate or regulate in technology, and that's it's a caricature. There's always some truth to caricature, but the reality is more complex. And in fact, U.S. regulatory agencies are quite active these days in establishing regulatory requirements for the particular sectors that fall within their jurisdiction. So this is a big difference between the way that the United States has historically approached technology regulation, whether we're talking about cybersecurity, data protection, you name it, compared to Europe. Europe tends to pass big kind of sweeping cross-sectoral laws. So GDPR, the Cybersecurity Act, NIS2, the AI Act. The U.S. tends to proceed on a more sector by sector basis. So there's a lot happening on that front in sort of in various sectors. I would say another big area of focus, both among academics and certainly by this administration, and I would put it more in the form of a question, because I don't think there's a clear answer yet. But the question that's being asked is, is the balance of responsibility between vendors and their customers for cybersecurity the right balance? In other words, are we asking or expecting customers to shoulder more of the security burden than is appropriate compared to the vendors that actually create the software? You can sort of, if you go back and look at the Biden administration's national cybersecurity strategy, which it issued late last spring, there's a lot of talk in it about this recalibration. And since then, there's been a lot of intellectual work that my colleagues at Stanford, along with sort of a network of other experts, primarily law professors, have undertaken to think through, okay, what would, for example, a new liability framework look like for software? Much of this work has been supported and encouraged by the White House. And to the point where it wouldn't surprise me if we saw a formal legislative proposal coming out from the White House in the next few months, proposing sort of a recalibration of this balance. Now, this is a 5 to 10 year problem. It's very complex. Congress does move slow, the U.S. Congress, so there won't be immediate legislative action. But this is sort of the early stages of trying to kind of fundamentally rethink this balance of responsibility between vendors and their customers.
Very interesting. So digging deeper on both of this, I think you are right, but it is interesting. We are thinking that here in Europe that it is mostly Europe doing the regulation, and in the US it's all about innovation, and the private sector is sort of stretching its wings without much limitations. When you say that there is difference in approach vis-a-vis to regulation in Europe and the US being more sector specific, would you dig a little deeper on the US regulation side? Like, can you walk us a little bit like deeper into who are the American regulators. There's the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission and its cyber rules. But what is that perhaps more exactly? Can you tell our listeners a little bit more? Who are they? What do they do? And I understand that one of the latest federal reports have been targeting Microsoft. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So, regulatory agencies in the United States, like most other countries, typically have a safety mandate in many cases, or a reliability mandate, depending on the sector. So, take bulk electricity distribution as an example. That's a sector that in the United States it has a particular regulator. It's called NERC, the National Electric Reliability Corporation. It's actually a quasi private organization that works with the bulk electricity sector on reliability rules across the risk spectrum for electricity, so not just cybersecurity, but other aspects. And what NERC does is develop proposed rules that the federal government then approves or revises. And there's that sector developed cybersecurity regulatory requirements. I'm going to say 10 years ago now. It's somewhere in that time frame. The Health and Human Services Department, which is responsible for regulating the healthcare sector in the United States under a law called HIPAA. HIPAA has a security and a privacy components to it. So you do find these sort of piecemeal interventions. I don't want to convey the impression, though, that the sweep is comprehensive. And I'll give you an example. Last year, the Environmental Protection Agency, which has regulatory jurisdiction over water, issued guidance. I put air quotes around guidance because it's non-binding in many ways, but as a practical matter, water suppliers more or less have to follow it. It was challenged in court, and as the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, overstepping its regulatory jurisdiction, and the court agreed to temporarily halt this initiative, and the EPA got scared and withdrew the guidance. And so, believe it or not, the water system in the United States is not subject to any federal cybersecurity requirements, which is kind of mind-blowing in many ways. So there's this patchwork. You mentioned the SEC rule. That's an example of a rule again that covers a particular sector. So we're talking about public companies, as well as investment advisors and some other sort of areas that fall under the SEC's jurisdiction. What's interesting there is, in many cases, the organic authority that the agency has is rooted in their traditional mission. And so in the SEC's case, the SEC's mission is fundamentally ensuring that the market works appropriately, oftentimes by requiring companies to be transparent about their risk. And so, I say this only half joking. The SEC doesn't really care about cybersecurity; it cares about transparency in the marketplace. And so, the disclosure rules are about enabling investors to make informed risk decisions, not necessarily about requiring companies to achieve a certain threshold of cyber risk resilience. It's a subtle difference, but I think it does speak to this patchwork, and in the EPA case, how there might be gaps, but then also how the cybersecurity mission is going to reflect the sort of the broader regulatory mission of the agency that's promulgating the rules. We could debate whether that approach is better or worse than sort of the blanket approach that say Europe or even China has taken. I think there are pros and cons to both sides, but that's sort of our system as it exists today.
But then, yes, thanks for that. regarding, however, this federal report vis-a-vis Microsoft, that was not the SEC, I understand, but the U.S. Department of Homeland Security releasing a cyber safety review board's findings and recommendations. Is that does that fall into the same category, or is that different from what we've been talking?
I would say it's a bit of both, right? So um, just by way of background, so the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, part of the Department of Homeland Security, has this cyber safety review board that is comprised of outside government appointees. But it's led by DHS, but it has these outside experts who had this mission to investigate major cyber incidents and provide sort of lessons learned about them. So just earlier this week, it issued a report on this incident last summer involving Microsoft and the Chinese government hacking into using weaknesses and vulnerabilities in Microsoft systems to hack into a variety of targets, including many U.S. government targets. So this is it's a report with some recommendations, but it doesn't have any sort of organic regulatory heft behind it. It's sort of put out there for the public, the market to consume. So it's unique, but I do think it's sort of consistent with the broader sort of market orientation of the U.S. Regulatory approach to cybersecurity, for better or worse. And I do think it's notable. So I should say, I mean, this report, I encourage your listeners to do a Google search and take a look at it. It is really scathing, deservedly so for Microsoft. I'll note though that as bad as this report is for Microsoft, Microsoft's stock price went up, which is a puzzle, and I think says something about the state of competition in the marketplaces for cloud, for productivity software, and for operating system, where Microsoft really has a strong grip on the marketplace, in part because it's really hard to switch, and so Microsoft has its customers locked in. Otherwise, it's hard to explain why, after a report this bad, its stock price thrives.
There is that puzzle, but looking at these state-backed hackers targeting Microsoft in China, for this case, we here in Estonia are concerned for Russia-backed state hackers. Does this show that there's more, like, these global industries are targeted, like Microsoft, like Google, like Amazon, that we are all using, or vis-a-vis the governments themselves and the government networks? So do you see this as a new trend, or what does it say to governments as they try to protect themselves vis-a-vis these crafted, clever, very sophisticated state-backed hackers? A government network or government can be as good as it tries to be, yet we all use, or often are using, Microsoft and based products, and thereby the vulnerabilities are also pendant on the private sector, the big industry, taking cybersecurity seriously. What's your take on this?
Well, I think this comes back to the point I made earlier about this sort of nascent early stage debate in the United States about software liability and whether the balance of responsibility between vendors and their customers is the right balance. I think it's the challenges that Microsoft has had in recent years, and really going back 20 years with respect to its products having a higher prevalence of vulnerabilities than some of their competitors, it has really sort of forced this question. And I think in Microsoft's case, part of, and I don't necessarily mean to pick on Microsoft, though I think in many ways they deserve it. Microsoft has for 4 or 5 years now has built up a security business that didn't really exist before. This business is at least a $20 billion a year business, according to Microsoft statements. The last statement to this effect was, I think, about a year ago, and it had been growing, doubling almost every year since the pandemic. And the security business is, in many ways, Microsoft upselling security for its own products, which, to my way of thinking, is like a car dealership selling you brakes when you buy your car. You go to sign the contract for your car, begin to drive it off the lot, and you realize, oh, there aren't brakes here, and the dealer says, oh wait, you got to pay extra for that. Sorry, even though it's a critical sort of safety feature. And I think the question that we ought to be asking is, what are the sort of the cyber resilience equivalents to seatbelts, to brakes, to some of these basic standard safety features, that ought to be sort of by analogy found in software. It's a hard question to answer, but it's, again, I think this these problems you identified are I think highlight the need for this recalibration. Obviously, nation state threat actors present a different threat profile than your typical hacker. That said, many of the incidents that have affected the United States. I don't know enough about Estonia's recent cyber history to say if this is similar in Estonia or not. But in the United States, at least, these often involve known vulnerabilities. They involve configuration mistakes that are often a result of just the complexity of these systems. They're hard to maintain, and so even though it may be a nation state, they may not need to deploy their super weapons, right, to break in if sort of we leave the equivalent of the front door unlocked.
Absolutely, I think you are very right. We of course need to be afraid of the 0 days, but in the end, if we don't regularly patch, that's where the key the majority of that's how the majority of incidents happen. And I think you're right. And I think it's interesting to be identifying the safety belts, the brakes, and the other safety measures of cybersecurity. In that regards, however, it makes me think that this goes over. It's beyond sectors, because these types of safety belts or safety measures are not universal, but definitely similar and not so specific in different sectors. So there is the question, a philosophical question, a little bit of when one does regulate, it makes sense to regulate cross sectors. But perhaps this is my European thinking driving me here.
Well, I think that's right. I think this, what may be standard in one area, maybe overkill or underkill in another area. So, for example, even in the realm of taking a step back from cars and say ground transportation, right? Delivery trucks in the United States have a different set of safety requirements than ordinary consumer vehicles, because the theory is that the risk is higher. So there's sort of a floor that's set, right? They all have to have seatbelts, brakes, airbags, right? That basic technology, where I think you're absolutely right. But then, depending on the specifics of the sector, that sector's risk profile, maybe you have additional requirements. And so, in the United States, there's, and I think this is true in Europe too. When delivery trucks back up, they beep, right? They make that noise. ordinary consumer cars don't really do that in the United States. The trucking industry, right? Another different sector. Also, ground transportation subject to a different set of rules. Including different behaviors expected of the drivers. If we're going to analogize the driver to the end user of the technology, so I agree with you. There may need to be sort of a floor that's established that cuts across sectors, but I think we ought to leave room for customization within sectors to meet whatever unique risk challenges that sector faces.
Okay, fair. Touching a little bit some of the more sort of like new and upcoming subjects, such as the large language models, the LLM, and the AR. What how would you comment their impact on the, or what role do they play in this overall cybersecurity challenge landscape that countries face today? Would you say that the fear of missing out is any significant factor in driving the corporate adoption of large language models, into not considering sufficiently the risk mitigations? So do you see the sort of like, in short, the LLMs and the AI developments more as an opportunity or as a threat, if we try to put it simplistically?
Well, yeah, I think it's a bit of both, right? And there's huge upside in many sectors for the use of large language models, and obviously, they can be abused, including to improve the ability of hackers to identify and carry out attacks. I think your point about fear of missing out, FOMO, is spot on. I think there's a lot of peer pressure that I've seen in companies, especially in areas like investment advisory, private equity, hedge funds, where there's intense competition for even the slightest edge, which can yield really significant returns. I think that part of what has struck and concerned me about the way that the debate about AI governance has gone globally, not just here in the United States, not just in Europe, but really globally, is this tendency to treat AI as a distinct risk vertical, as though it were not a digital technology, but something altogether different. And the fact is, AI are computers, and the algorithms are maybe different, but they still operate on digital systems. In many cases, they will be embedded in classical computing systems or operating alongside classical computing systems. And the question that we ought to be asking, in my view, is not, how do we govern AI? It's what is different about AI that requires us to potentially think differently about risk. It's a gap analysis. And I think in the process, of performing that gap analysis, it's also an occasion for us to rethink some of our assumptions about, digital security writ large. And I think, this question of what's the right balance between vendors and their customers for cybersecurity risk is a great example of this the possibility for this kind of reflection between these two types of digital technology. I think in many ways, concern about AI is driving, I think, a much more focused discussion and debate about security and safety than really ever existed for classical technologies. I mean, can you imagine if we had the intensity of focus on AI safety and security? If we were to if 25 years ago, right? It's sort of 30 years ago at the dawn of the internet revolution, we had the same debate. I think the world would be a lot more secure. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities to use AI as a mirror, right? To look at sort of bigger questions around digital risk. I think that again, coming back to your point about fear of missing out, there is a lot of peer pressure, and I do some consulting work for companies on this, and I always tell them, it's about the basics, right? Ask sort of the basic risk questions you would ask about adoption of any other technology. That's where you start. And there will be gaps probably that emerge because AI is different in many key respects than classical technologies. But I still think there's a lot more that's similar than not. And starting from the standpoint of having to reinvent sort of the governance wheel, I think is problematic.
Very good. Well, I'm actually glad that you're seeing, especially when discussing the AI, which very often is something that scares people and makes their head spins. In your discussions, you distinguish some significant benefits to it, and as you rightly point out, the key is to start asking the right questions. And as a way of wrapping up this conversation, I think it's been an enjoyable to hear you sort of formulate the right questions before jumping into then finding the right answers to them. So thank you very much for your time. All this, I would say, is a warm-up to our fireside chat itself at the e-governance conference in Tartu in Estonia on May 22nd. Join us there. Find out more, meanwhile, about the conference at egovconference.de. And much looking forward to seeing everybody in Tartu in May. Thank you.
Thank you, Merle.
This podcast is brought to you by the eGovernance Academy. Tune in next time.